Hello and welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. I'm your host, Mark Gallivan. This is episode 42 of our show, and you can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP42 for episode 42. The show notes include details about today's episode, including a full written transcript. Recently, AVS staff member and founder Larry Welshon traveled to beautiful Montana to give a speech at one of our sister schools called Glacier Lake. He got to explore their lovely campus, speak to their staff members, and end the day by giving a speech all about his experience at our school in an effort to help Glacier Lake reach their fundraising goals. You can learn more about Glacier Lake by visiting the show notes page, and I encourage you to contribute to their fundraising efforts, even if only slightly, to help them move forward. We're all in this together, and we want to see all self-directed democratic schools continue to survive and thrive for many, many years to come. Today's show features audio from the talk that Larry gave at their fundraising dinner and includes a few never-before-featured tidbits from Larry's own journey to alternative education. I found this to be an excellent talk, and it's one of my favorite things we've ever published on the show. I really hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, here's Larry.
Thank you. I have some prepared remarks, but I also want to comment, in the time that I've been involved with this movement of we would call them Sudbury schools, right? But I'm not sure you use the word Sudbury in your model. But it's the same thing. So anytime I go to a school like this, I walk in and I can tell immediately that it's very similar to mine. And it's the same with this one. Even though I didn't get to be here yesterday when there were kids here, walking in the building here, meeting with the staff, et cetera, it's very clearly a school very much like mine. And I think what I've heard tonight, in 5 years, what you guys have accomplished is tremendous. The stories that have preceded my tale here tonight are wondrous. And after only 5 years, I think you've really made it. I think you guys have a real treasure here. This is a fantastic place. So I'll go on with my prepared remarks. So in 1988, I graduated with a degree in history and a powerful desire to teach. It didn't matter where. During that awkward phase between graduating and getting hired, my days were filled with working with kids in an open space program. One day, I got home, and I had on an answering machine, which some of us remember what answering machines are, right? Yeah, it has tape in it, right? Anyway, there was this message that says, "Hi, Larry. This is Larry from Less Normal High School. Give me a call. I'd like to interview you." I thought, Less Normal High School? I'm sure that's what I heard. So my then girlfriend, later to be my wife and mother of our children, we drove out to this very impoverished school district north of Denver for my interview with a man named Larry. It turned out the school was Les Arnold High School, not Less Normal. Right? Nonetheless, it turned out to be less normal, but my 10 years there were formative and changed the course of my life and laid the groundwork for Alpine Valley School, which is the school that my wife and I started. So my students at that point were dropouts who, to their credit, were trying to get some kind of credential so that they could find employment and better their very tough lives in one of the most depressed areas of Denver. And for some reason, I bonded strongly with them. I enjoyed working with them, and I enjoyed talking with them. And keep in mind, at that point, I was 22, so many of my students were not much younger than me. The program allowed me a great deal of freedom to teach as I saw fit. It also allowed me the time just to sit and talk with them. The conversations would invariably turn to schooling, our one common experience. I was a good student in my schooling career and had the good fortune of attending what was considered to be a great school. Yet, as I talked with my students from a much different schooling situation, much of what they said resonated with my own experiences. What I heard in conversations with hundreds of kids over the course of those years fundamentally altered the way I viewed education and human beings. Over and over, I heard the same thing. One, when a student has a real need to learn, when their need is theirs and theirs alone, they don't need me to teach them. They can do it themselves. Number two, nearly all of my students dropped out mentally in 4th grade. But physically at 15. And with very few exceptions, these dropouts were very intelligent. And I'll touch briefly on each of these 3 points. My students had to master reading, writing, math, in what is arguably a pretty high level. The GED test was not an easy test to pass, and in later years we conducted some tests of the conventional school graduates in the district and found that many of them couldn't pass the GED tests. That study was quickly buried. Of course, we didn't talk about that. But I digress. These kids were 17 through 21, and they'd returned to get some sort of credential. Most of them had their own kids. Most of them had jobs. When they showed up in my classroom, they were tired and just needed to get the work done. These kids came in, some having been gone from school for years. With precious little teaching help from me, they taught themselves how to read, write, do math, basic geometry, algebra, write extemporaneously. They had a need to learn, and they learned what they need to know in that moment. I hesitate to dwell on too much teacher bashing or system bashing, but it needs to be mentioned that, if only briefly, I spent 10 years in the public school system, my wife even longer, and she and I were both products of the system and believe deeply in the importance of teaching and education. The burdens that were and are placed on classroom teachers are untenable. No matter how loving and kind a person is, the system forces teachers into roles that separate them from students. Our common humanity fades into the background. The obsessive focus on measurement and tests and rubrics, etc., leave a gaping chasm in what should be a very human experience of older people hanging out with younger people, teaching them how to live. Recall that I mentioned that the kids dropped out in fourth grade mentally. I find that still true today. When I interview families and students who've been, they're 12 or 13 years of age, sure enough, the same thing is true today. 30 years later, they're still dropping out in fourth grade mentally, which is very interesting to me. Because of the dehumanizing attributes of the conventional schooling system, classroom teachers are not given the opportunity to see how intelligent children are in their natural state. But enough of negative. So here we are, back in 1993. My wife and I are both public school teachers. We're newly wed and establishing ourselves in career. My wife's name was Tammy, and about this time I started working on a master's degree in administration, convinced that I could become a principal and change the world just by being a high school principal. Well, not long into the program, Tammy and I realized that we ourselves were going to be parents, and it was great and exciting news. Tammy, being more forward-looking than I, said, "What are we going to do for our kids?" And I'm like, that's 5 years away. What are you worried about? But she was thinking. So she started researching models of schooling throughout the pregnancy. And about a month before our son was born, I found myself at an alternative ed conference. And there was a breakout session with a staff from Sudbury Valley School in Massachusetts, which is a school very similar to my school, very similar to this school. And the description on the little handout was very brief, something like students ages 4 to 19 in a democratically run school are in charge of their lives. So very short. And I thought, that sounds kind of interesting. So I went there and I listened to Mimsy Sadovsky, who is a staff member at Sudbury Valley then and now. And she said something more elegant. She said something like this: "The Sudbury Valley School is a place where children are free. Their natural curiosity is the starting point for everything that happens at the school. Here, students initiate all their own activities. The staff, the building, the equipment are all there to answer their needs. Learning takes place in formal and informal settings, in large and small groups or individually. All ages are free to mix at all times. The dynamics among students of different ages helping each other learn everything from human relations to math is one of the greatest strengths of the school. Students share responsibility for their own environment and for the quality of life at school. The school is managed by the weekly school meeting, where every student and staff member has a vote. And education at Sudbury Valley is also an education in hands-on democracy." Wow, I thought, that's exactly what I wanted. As a teacher, as a parent, freedom for the students, freedom for the teachers, a small community, age mixing, curiosity, barely able to contain myself. I said, "Mimsy," I just met this person too, by the way, right? "Mimsy, is there a school like this in Colorado?" And she said, "No. Why don't you start one?" Right. So I went home and talked it over with Tammy, where I got excited about the community and freedom and decision-making, community decision-making, age mixing, and what else. She saw something different. Children could do art all they wanted without interruption. Tammy was an artist. Her whole being exuded art and creativity. In her formative years, that creative impulse had to fit into the schedule of the school day. At a school like Sudbury Valley, or later Alpine Valley, she could have done art all day long, year in and year out. So by this point, Tammy is very, very pregnant. So we put the research of schooling off. And on the day she was to go into labor, I had an important meeting with the district, right? And so I called up the director of curriculum and I said, hey, my wife's going into labor. I won't be at the meeting. And I kid you not, she said this to me. She said, well, I can see where your loyalties lie. Click. She and I never got along after that, which was all for the best, and the handwriting was on the wall. So Ethan was born. I'm back at work 3 months later, and I'm complaining to an elderly friend of mine about my teaching job, mainly having to do with the fact that I couldn't do what I wanted to do, right? So he said, seriously, he says, Larry, when you take the king's coin, you sing the king's tune. I thought, oh my gosh. I said, well, Ken, would you help me start a Sudbury school? And he said, yes. So his pithy phrase about taking the king's coin resonated with me so deeply that 26 years later, I could still hear it in my head. It's about being independent, but it is more than that. As an elder in my community, he was pointing out a fundamental truth about living free in a community, and he was willing to back it up by supporting my wife and I in starting what would become Alpine Valley School. He donated generously to the school even before we became a nonprofit entity. As Tammy and I started working toward creating an independent school where children could live their own lives, others helped out too. We could not have done it without their financial, emotional, and other support. Even today, 22 years running, Alpine Valley School relies on the generous contribution of a few members of our larger community, without whose help we would have had to close many years ago. After a false start in 1995, we did finally open the doors to the Alpine Valley School in a rented church in 1997. And as is said, the rest is history. And it's that history I want to touch on for the remainder of my comments. I think that as immodest as it will sound, the kids that we've had have been very positively affected by Alpine Valley School. So I'll describe a few of them. One of my favorite stories is about a girl who came to our school when she was 6 years old. She was passionate about horses. Owning a horse was not feasible for her family, so she devised a plan of volunteering at barns. So with a little help from staff, she cracked open a phone book. Remember those? Big, thick, right? Mm-hmm. Especially in Metro Denver, right? They were like this thick, right? So she went through the phone book to find barns to volunteer at, right? So she would call them. This is a young girl, 8 years old. She'd say, would you accept a volunteer to help, muck out the stalls or whatever? And they'd say, sure. And then they would ask the next question. How old are you? Right. As you might expect, that would put the kibosh on it most of the time. But undeterred, she kept at it and eventually found a barn to volunteer at and work at, and horses became a big part of her life and still are today. Children at our school grow up believing confidently that they can do the things that are important to them. They learn how to overcome obstacles and develop tenacity in the face of rejection. That girl, now a young woman, and her Alpine Valley School alum husband have created a beautiful life that suits them together. It's deeply satisfying. And I attribute that to the fact that they were in charge of their lives from a very early age. So earlier this week, a current student and I were chatting about a certain graduate who happened to be visiting that morning. And by the way, once you get a few graduates under your belt, you want to come back and say hi, right? And so periodically we have graduates come by the school to say hi, and they hang out for an hour or two. So I was sitting there with a student, and the student says, why does everyone who goes to this school have such an interesting career path? And before I could even contemplate the question, he says, oh yeah, It's because they can do what they want. So children growing up into our school constantly hear you can do what you want. But what does that really mean? We actually heard, I think, some other speakers talk about this problem. I can do what I want in terms of cookies for dinner, I think. Right? So what's the long-term impact of a kid who lives out their life thinking that they can do what they want, right? So at first, it's simple things, right? I can eat when I want. I can play what I want. In that particular conversation with this kid last week, I played devil's advocate and I said, surely you can't do anything you want here. And he immediately said, of course, that's right. There are limits. So the development of these limits is an interesting topic to me because being a freedom-minded person myself, I myself always want to do what I want. That's who I am. So eventually, all of us in the school run into a conflict with others. When the I can do what I want runs into your I can do what I want, I can play with the blocks, and so can William. Becomes a problem when both of us want to do it right now. Now, the seemingly nonchalant attitude of I can do what I want has taken on new meaning. In that moment, do I decide to play nicely? Do I negotiate? Do I just sit there? I don't know. If I'm really young, it might take me a long time to figure this out. Over time, you hone the idea of I can do what I want by understanding that my right to do what I want is tempered by everyone else's right to do what they want. So we manage this balance of freedom and community in Sudbury schools with a law book. I believe we've talked about that tonight too, written by students and staff and enforced by students and staff through the Judicial Committee. This law-abiding, individual-respecting culture is developed imperceptibly, moment to moment, day to day, in thousands of interactions. A young human being who's preparing to enter the society that holds individual liberty as a cornerstone is best served by practicing on a daily basis how to live with others while doing what you want to do. Put another way, how do we live peacefully with each other in a society where everyone else's right to do what they want to do runs into someone else's? Imagine how the world would be different if people learned early on that you can't encroach on other people's rights. As the students at Alpine Valley School get older, different facets of the issue become evident because the stakes become larger. Perhaps what I can do, what I want, takes a bit of fundraising or permission from an official body in the school. A few years ago, when a group of students wanted to go traveling, they raised money over 2 years to fully fund a trip around the state of Colorado. So I can do what I want became I can do what I want, but I have to earn it. Each one of these kids still talks about that experience, even though they're now relatively old and close to their 30s. But they talk about it still. It was a formative experience for them. Another experience example involves my son, Ethan. So Ethan, of course, today is an old man. He's like 26. He's terribly old. So at Alpine Valley School, we have a huge sandbox. And Ethan was always digging holes in the sandbox. Channels, digging holes, channels, worlds, making worlds, creating things. And always doing this. And not just when he was a little kid. He was playing in the sandbox when he was 18, right? Mostly, sometimes with little kids, right? Because it kind of works that way in a school where there's all ages. So beginning about age 12, Ethan starts digging holes. And each year, the holes got deeper and deeper. And naturally, big holes in the sandbox affect others, especially those who are playing tag or groundies on the play structure. How do you manage that as a person who's growing up in a school? He and his hole-digging friends found a way to accommodate their wishes and their own wishes in the same place. Ethan's whole ambition became more serious, or should I say deeper, over the years. By the time he was 16, he was set on finding gold that existed in the sandbox. This was not a whimsical notion. From the earliest of ages, Ethan studied geology, and he knew a great deal about geology. And when the school hired an adult staff member at one point who tangentially was a geologist, he said to me, Ethan knows more about geology than I do. So Alpine Valley sits in this floodplain from Clear Creek, which is near Denver. And Ethan and his friends reasoned that when Clear Creek was, raging thousands of years ago, the gold was washing down from the river, and deposited widely in the area. So he starts to dig, and the hole got bigger and bigger. The piles around the hole became higher as the hole got deeper. The official worrywart of the school, also known as Larry, and not a real position, made sure that there was shoring and the hole was covered when not in use. And the same worrywart was also the school's grounds clerk, which is an actual position. It was the grounds clerk's understanding that he had the authority to manage and allow this project. The hole got deeper. It was now 13 feet deep, 7 feet across. It was so deep that the boys had to rent a hose and a pump to keep out the groundwater. It became a huge production. And many people in the school were involved. Strangers drove by, slowed down, watched, some with alarm, some with curiosity. And as the project kept going, more and more of the sandbox became a mine dump. And the campus was beginning to look, well, in my mind, it looked beautiful because it was industry and they were productive and they were doing cool things. But in others' minds, not so much. So in the school, grumblings began to be heard throughout the community. Why are they being allowed to monopolize the whole sandbox? It looks terrible. So from Ethan's perspective and the other miners' perspective, he checked with the right person, the grounds clerk. The grounds clerk said, cool, do it. But the Neatniks challenged this. So to the law book we went. Did the grounds clerk actually have the authority to allow this gigantic hole? Was there any legal recourse to stop them? Sure enough, when we looked at the laws, it appeared that the responsibility actually lay with the Aesthetics and Use Committee, not the grounds clerk. So as you can see, sometimes the I can do what I want, higher authorities get involved. So case in point, Aesthetics and Use Committee. Do you guys have Aesthetics and Use Committee? Okay, so it's a big committee in our school, and it deals with everything that you can possibly do with the campus, whether it's putting things on the wall or apparently digging holes in the sandbox. It met. There were meetings. There was argument. Digging kept going. The committee made a decision. The hole would be closed by a date certain. So, and I have a comment from one of Ethan's friends who wrote about this whole experience. His name was Ethan. So he says this about that hole. This incredible long-term project taught me many things. Most importantly, determination and patience. It also furthered my ability to cooperate and taught me good work ethics from having to stay focused on the mine hour after hour, day after day. This project will always be my favorite memory from Alpine Valley School. It constantly reminds me that working hard all the way to the end is worth it. Did they find gold? They did. They did. So they got down to the bottom and they dug out all the black sands at the bottom, and they were river rocks this big. It was huge. This 13 feet down. So they're hauling out these river rocks, hauling out the black sand. And then they created a gravity separator, and sure enough, they had a little vial of gold flakes. So for 22 years, I've seen how this model changes the lives of students. Whether they enroll young, or as tweens, or as teens, students who learn the deeper meaning of I can do what I want, graduate from our schools knowing their own interests and how to achieve their goals. They have a much better sense about how to live life on their own, even if they make different choices from other people. Our graduates look back fondly on their years at Alpine Valley School because they learned crucial lessons about being effective adults. The simple idea of I can do what I want manifests in such powerful and unexpected ways at Alpine Valley School. It's really not a simple idea at all, because it plays out in a community of equals, much like the society we live in. One of the biggest impacts our school has on children and the adults who live there is to help us understand that community is crucially important to any endeavor. Whether it's the community of 2 5-year-olds playing with blocks, a group of preteens fundraising for a trip, teenagers digging for gold, or a couple of starry-eyed young parents who wanted a different school for their children, all of us are living together at the school in a scaled-down version of the larger community. We all need each other in lots of different ways. We learn how to get along with each other. We learn how to get what we want without harming or taking advantage of others. These are pretty good traits, and our graduates, all graduates from schools like this, have them in abundance. Thank you.
I hope you'll take a minute to visit the show notes page at alpinevalley.com/podcast/EP42 and learn more about our sister school, Glacier Lake in Montana. Ben and Lisa, the founders, are treasures in the self-directed learning movement, and I really hope you'll all lend a hand to their fundraising efforts as well. As always, thanks for listening. I'm Mark Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School Podcast, and we'll be back again soon with more stories of real learning for real life.